Hello everyone, this is Dwayne Monroe, one of the co-hosts, alongside Dennis Claxton and RC Charles Roberts of the Film Conversations podcast. In today's episode, we speak with Amrita, postdoctoral fellow in the Center of Humanities and Information at Penn State University, about All That Breathes, a 2022 documentary film directed by Shaunak Sen. Let me read a bit about Amrita from her page on the Penn State University website. Amrita's research focuses on Global South masculinity studies and affect theory. Her works have been published in NORMA, Boyhood Studies, Global Humanities, and are forthcoming in other edited collections. She's also working her way through her first novel, centered around contemporary Indian masculinities. And the link to Amrita's work is included in the show notes. And now I'm going to read a synopsis of All That Breathes from the film's Wikipedia page. All That Breathes is a 2022 documentary film directed by Shaunak Sen. It is produced by Shaunak Sen, Aman, and Teddy Leifer under the banner of Rise Films. The film follows siblings Mohammad, Saud, and Nadeem, Shehzad, who rescue and treat injured birds in India. The film had its world premiere at the 2022 Sundance Film Festival on January 22 of 2022, where it won Grand Jury Prize in World Cinema Documentary Competition. It also had a screening at the Cannes Film Festival in the special screening section, where it won the Golden Eye. It was later nominated for the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature Film. And now, the synopsis of the plot. Two brothers, Saud and Nadeem, were raised in New Delhi, looking at a sky speckled with black kites, watching as relatives tossed meat up to these birds of prey. Muslim belief held that feeding the kites would expel troubles. Now birds are falling from the polluted, opaque skies of New Delhi, and the two brothers have made it their life's work to care for the injured black kites. This was an excellent conversation, and we were very glad to have Amrita as a guest. I hope you enjoy. Hey everyone, this is Dwayne Monroe, one of the co-hosts, along with Dennis Claxton and RC Charles Roberts of the Film Conversations podcast. And as I mentioned in the introduction, our special guest today is Amrita. And Amrita, why don't you give us an introduction to yourself? And before you do, let me say that the film that we are considering, as I mentioned in the intro, is All That Breathes, and we'll be talking about that. But before diving into that, Amrita, tell our audience something about yourself and what you're working on and what your interests are, and also what is it about this film that speaks to you?
Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm very excited to be here. This is also my first podcast. So I'm audible, right? Yeah. So, so this is also my first podcast. So I'm very, very excited. So I am primarily a gender studies researcher. So I just completed my PhD last year, actually. I'm a newly minted PhD person in masculinity studies, where I look at just the idea of masculinity in terms of its ontological instability. I think it's ontologically unstable. So I'm thinking of masculinity more in terms of its genesis as a philosophical concept, and then the ideas of virility, stoicism, entrepreneurship, how all of these ideas are associated with the idea of masculinity, and then how it is socio-culturally translated in different contexts, and how, if you kind of unpack the layers of it, you will see that it's very, very fragile as a construct itself. So this has been primarily my PhD dissertation, and I focused on South Asia. I focused on more of a genealogical historical archive of how to think about masculinity through literature and films. What are the main tropes that comes up? So that would be my main sort of focus. And I also try to think about masculinity more in terms of the ideas of immanence rather than through transcendental ideas of good and bad masculinity or what it means to be a good man or a bad man. I'm not really interested in those kind of binary questions. So I am more interested in thinking about how, non-instrumental storytelling can render visible, moments which are articulating composite ideas in a complex way. So, which is, I think, one of the main reasons why I'm drawn to All That Breathes. It's a Indian documentary film by Shaunak Sen, which has been, doing the rounds. It has won a lot of, accolades, very prominent accolades, and it was in Sundance. I think it won the Grand Jury Award. It was nominated for the Oscars. So it's been like, pretty hailed. And what drew me to this film is also the idea of non-instrumental storytelling, but also done through a certain kind of instrumentality, because this is obviously like a documentary form, but it's also very unlike a documentary form. It is, I would label it as creative nonfiction, but then it's also like, classified under the documentary form. So, I think in terms of just ideas of human, non-human entanglement, and also like our serious attachment to the, air as a, if I have to think about the cosmological universe, air as something that connects us all. So it's mainly through that lens that I'm interested in thinking about this film, and also about how the human protagonists are not necessarily underlined as much as, operating on the same level playing field, if you would, with all the other non-human beings. So that's a very interesting aesthetic sort of a way to narrate, because it it does not try to sort of anthropomorphize human sort of a lens. So these are some of the interesting ways, but of course it's also brings with itself its own set of complications, and about what it is narrating, what is the political focus. It's a political film, in my opinion, but it is definitely not frontally loaded as political, because that's something that Shaunak Sen is very, very insistent on, that he didn't intend to make a political film. But I think people are aware of the fact right now that, India is going through a very important political moment, because ideas of secularism is almost like pretty much held hostage in the moment. There is the rising idea of majoritarian Hindu nationalism. So all of that is happening right now in India, and it has been happening for a long time, actually, since 2014, which is all. I mean, I always feel like when this is going to come to an head, because like things are getting worse. It's interesting primarily for me because it reflects the gestation period of the making itself in the content, because it's made. I think it has been made over 3 years, if I'm correct. And it also shows the changing political economy, and to a moment when this somewhat apolitical family also gets like, somewhat politicized, not because they want to be politicized, but it's also how the outside is leaking in, in terms of the infrastructure of the just the building itself. Like, so you'll see that a lot of the politics is happening from outside. So there's this sense of it seeping in. And I am kind of very, very interested in how that kind of, storytelling, I guess, renders visible the many, many ethical questions that are, happening on the ground or brewing as we speak. And what would be that, what would be the ethics of that kind of position? So I'm sorry, this has been a very long intro, but yeah, this would be something that
No,
I'm
that's that's fine. That's fine. So there's a few things there, because you're referring to your studies, your research into masculinity, as a not fluid, but as an unstable, construct. And also, this film tells the story, but not in a traditional intimate way of these two brothers and their work, rescuing the kite birds, actually. and also, of course, the changing political situation in India. And I'm curious about your thoughts regarding how masculinity, or the idea of masculinity as it is manifested in India and in the political climate of India that evolved since 2014. How would I put this? How that's reflected in the film, if at all, and if the way that the brothers are presented, because they're not, very aggressive, or as you say, they're not politically active, and obviously you don't get the idea that they're these strident believers in one particular perspective or another. How is masculinity being reframed by the political currents in India in recent years, and how is that reflected in the film, if at all?
Could I say something here?
Sure.
You mentioned seeping in the politics. That is very much the language. Preparing for this, I have watched a lot of interviews with the director, and he's very good in interviews. Our last episode, we talked about directors and how they present themselves, and it's very performative normally. This guy, there is no pretense whatsoever when he's talking,
Mm-hmm.
and I just said, I promised myself I would stop doing that. So anyway, the most often, very often, maybe most often, interviewers are really not that good, and I did it again. So anyway, this guy, even when the interviewer is not that good, he's very good. So you said seeping in. So he used that kind of language. He said, he talked about leakage, that he wanted the politics to leak in. And he said, he mentioned Trojan horses, sneak things in. And with the ambient noise of people out on the balcony, and you hear the speeches. And he said, this is a quote, sensing the political through the aesthetic. He does that very well. So that's all. So go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, he is extremely articulate. He is himself, I think, has been teaching, I think, film theory or something like that. So I would expect Shaunak Sen to be very, very articulate in that sense. But in terms of, the way he talks about the political, it is through the lens of seeping in, leakage. He does talk about it, that it was not intended object of his storytelling initially, but it's just the way the landscape of the city changed that over the years, that he had to include that. And he also says that something very beautifully, that how this kind of filmmaking often is about patience and the kind of accidents that happen over time. It's not something that is contrived. It's almost like you have to just patiently wait for things to happen. You have to show up every day, and when you show up every day, sometimes you're just rewarded with the delicious design of just things that happen in this kind of a spatial organization. So I think that it worked for him in that sense, because just the way things are so political on the ground, that it's difficult to ignore. Even if you are an apolitical family at this moment, you wouldn't be able to ignore the politics. Now, going back to the question of...
Speaking of patience,
yeah.
Look who's arrived here. Charles.
Yes, you'll have to unmute yourself there, Charles.
Yeah, there we are.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Charles.
Hi. It's been a day. So,
yes, what the listeners may not know is that Charles arrived a little. Oh, I won't even say late. Yeah, he arrived fashionably late, as the saying goes. And Charles, when you arrived, we've actually already begun the conversation, and Amrita has been talking about the film as it relates to, or rather, the way the filmmakers inserted or allowed to seep in makers' words the political situation in India as they were filming into the film. But not in a way that's very obvious, obviously, but a way that's undeniable. And the question I had for Amrita was about how masculinity, ideas of masculinity, are presented in the film, and how they might agree with or actually clash with ideas of masculinity of the political class, of the dominant political class.
Yeah, Amrita, I mentioned this in the notes in preparation. This is very much a story of brothers.
Mm-hmm.
So, I know about brothers. I have two brothers, and I've mentioned before an Italian historian that I very much admire named Carlo Ginzburg, and he quotes an Italian expression. I'm paraphrasing. Friends love brothers' knives. Where family, you fight a lot, and you see that with these brothers. They fight a lot, but that's all. They fight a lot. So take it away, Amrita.
Yeah, I mean, with regard to masculinity, so the overarching political, framework is a very, very masculine, idea, right-wing masculinity. It's very, very similar to what you would think of in the American context as well. So that is definitely the political fabric. But in terms of the portrayal of the family itself, now, having lived in this kind of a context or having that lived experience, I think that, I don't know if like anything is being reframed as much as being shown as it is. So I wouldn't necessarily think of it as a typical or a atypical portrait of masculinity in any way. I would rather say that, this is how the family is. And I feel that Indian masculinity has its own, historical sort of an undercurrent in the way everyone thinks of it, the social organization of masculinity. And I'm really always thinking about social organization and not necessarily embodied forms of it. So in terms of that, I feel like these brothers are very, very interesting because you cannot frame them through that very obvious patriarchal lens, right? You cannot, at all read them in that lens, and it wouldn't be fair to read them in that lens at all. And I feel like that the non-instrumentality of that, aspect itself is very, very interesting because it does give a very composite idea of, different ways of doing masculinity. And it's not always through the very, very conventional framings of toxic masculinity and things like that, which are often associated with Indian masculinity. Now, having said that, what is interesting for me personally with regard to the stories of this family is that if you think about it, it is really the mother's spiritual philosophy or, greater cosmological philosophy that everything is a community of air, and every, human, non-human kind of idea is like everything needs to be valorized on the same plane. So it's almost like the brother is taking forward the mother's cosmological view of the world and inhabiting that. And so it's a very, very interesting way to, kind of think about it, because generally in these families, if you would imagine a patriarchal figurehead, but here it is the mother's philosophy, which is being the most dominant key point, right, in terms of why the brothers do what they do. And also, if you think about the political, it is the woman in the family, the brother's wife, who is more political, because she is saying that we should go to some of these processions that are happening, this protests that are happening, and he's like, yeah, you should go, but I also have work to do. And then she's kind of signaling the importance of participating in the politics in a public.
I remember one scene very clearly when they're talking about the quality of the air, and there's like an app on their phone where they can give a numerical value of the quality of the air. And the mother is saying something about, it's very bad today. And one of the brothers says something about the kites.
Yeah.
And she says, I was talking about your son. And I, looking around for, I did it again. Preparing for this, I saw who is the probably most famous Indian director? Rai, I believe is his name. Is that correct? Yeah. So there was a scene where a man comes in and his wife says, "Did you see the little monkey?" And he's saying, "There was a monkey?" And he's talking about a monkey. And she says, "I'm talking about your son." So it reminded me of that. Anyway, what I'm saying is, you're talking about the mother. The brothers are kind of fixated on the kites. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's completely true, right? Like, and I mean, it's not so much, I don't know if it's a fixation as much as, this genuine belief that, when the epistemic wallpaper of the city itself is so, it's always on the boil. It's almost like these are the things that I can do in my limited capacity, and let me do that. And I think Shaunak Sen does talk about this a lot in his interviews, that what really struck him about these brothers is that they're kind of like, philosophers of the urban, in the sense the way they think about space, and the way they don't have that maudlin sentimentality of like, I'm doing something to help or anything. It's more like they have a philosophy and they're like carrying it forward with a very put your head down kind of an attitude. Like, it's a very banal way of doing it. And I think that is also something that is exemplified by that non-instrumentality of the storytelling itself, that, there is no glorification of the work that they're doing. You can clearly see the rigorous methods in operation, like, them cutting meat, them sort of, I think there's this scene up with the air conditioner as well, the air conditioner not working. So you kind of see the nitty-gritty of how their everyday life is sort of organized around this. So this is also something which is very interesting. If I think about it, I'm only thinking about it on the spot in terms of masculinity, because there is no hyper fixation on a sense of individualism, right? Like, if you think of the family, it's a very collectivist kind of a project. Like, everyone is involved in helping. So there is no like head person doing something. It's like everyone is kind of doing it together. So that is a very, very interesting way, because it's not a very individualized idea. Yeah. So this is just something that I'm thinking of right now. Yeah.
You know what? You just mentioned individual and collective. I might not be here right now if not for a collective endeavor. As Dwayne and Charles know, I have fitful sleep often, and I post to them at 3 or 4 in the morning. So around sunrise in Los Angeles, I couldn't sleep. I was taking out the garbage. I come back and I turn my key and it breaks. I couldn't open my door. And fortunately, my daughter lives nearby and she has a key to my house. And so I go and wake her up at 7 on a Sunday. And I come back and I ask her, I said, hey, you get some pliers? And she's like, I don't know. And she comes out with this like little emergency pack, which people give to each other in California for earthquakes, etc. And there were pliers there. And I'm like, these are pliers, honey. So I'm going to take these. So I come back and I couldn't get the key with the pliers. And then a neighbor comes by and she's like, what's going on? And I said, and she said, hey, I got some tweezers. So she brought some tweezers, and they're pink tweezers. And, I don't have gender hang-ups. So I used the pink tweezers, and I finally was able to get into my house. The key is still in the deadbolt. But I'm here. My point is, an individualist solution to that problem would be to kick the door in.
Yes, exactly.
I could have done. I have, for reasons we don't need to go into, I have kicked the door in my past. So I know I could have done it, but the tweezers. So there's 3 people involved, at least, me, my daughter, and my neighbor. So the collectivism is superior, in my opinion.
Well, and not only superior, but actually it's the only way. I mean, one of the delusions of the West, particularly the United States, but I think this is also spread to other places, is of the rugged individualism. And in movies like, John Wayne and the Searchers, it's a beautiful movie by John Ford, but or the Sergio Leone Westerns. I mention Westerns because they're the archetypal examples of films about, these loners who somehow manage to survive being in these extreme conditions with, still looking cool, mind you, with their, their ponchos and their hats, and just crossing vast distances, of the American West. And I think that one of the mythologies of the United States is that it is possible for a person to simply, power their way through life as a lone individual. And this is actually a rather mad idea. It's actually quite insane. And it is responsible, I think, for a lot of, I'm not a clinician, but psychosis, because you run up against, the problem of not being able to do that and of needing help, and men in particular. And Amrita, I'm sure this is something that you have considered, these. Actually, Dennis likes to tell stories. I'll tell like a very brief story. Many years ago, I was dating a woman, and we were living in South Philly, and she had a car, and because she grew up on a farm. Actually, she moved to Philly from upstate Pennsylvania, so she grew up on a farm, and so she knew about fixing cars and so forth. And I was a city kid, and so I certainly was around cars, but I wasn't, working with carburetors, taking engines apart, except in shop class in high school, and but not like on an ongoing basis the way she was. One Sunday, there was a gentleman outside of our apartment whose car wouldn't start. Lots of noise happening. I recognized from some of the work I had done what the problem probably was, but I came outside because I was going to the market, and he asked me, because what do men do? Hey, buddy, what do you think? I had no idea. And so what I said to him was, you know what? I don't know, but let me ask my girlfriend. The look on his face. It was as if I had said, I'm going to beam up to the Enterprise and ask Spock. Like he would have accepted that probably more than he would have accepted me simply asking a woman, or me openly admitting that the woman in my life at the time knew more about the functioning of automobiles than I did. And so one of the things that I found refreshing about this movie was this kind of quiet sense of duty, but not in a tough guy way, just in a, we are a part of a larger structure of life. And these are things that we're doing, and we have ideas of how they should be done, many of which, as you said, Amrita, come from our mother, which seems appropriate to me. And although you would hope that your father also would give you some wise counsel. And I really appreciated that because it did remind me of some of the best things that I liked about growing up in a small neighborhood in West Philadelphia. West Philadelphia is a large territory of a big city, but my neighborhood was my little world when I was a kid. And it was very communal because we had to look out for each other. We had to look out for each other because of, as we would say, hood rats. But also mostly because you knew who the criminals were, and most of them didn't really bother you if you were a kid. Police. We had to be concerned about police all the time, and we were constantly alerting each other to what they were doing and so forth to help each other stay alive. But also growing up in a church community, with a less lethal concern, just cooking and doing all these things together.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I grew up in India as well. So this would be a portrait that I'm familiar with, the representation of the family where everyone is, working together, and there are, but, there are obviously, socialized ideas of gender and all of that, but it's always so complex and interesting because one is not always so overtly, what it is, right? So this is a movie which does that very well. And
I just before we started, I looked up. I've been meaning to do this for a couple of weeks, and I finally did it. The population of Delhi is 35 million, and when you look at this movie, you don't see 35 million people. You see like 4 or 5 people, And normally, when you talk about a movie about a big city, the city is part of the story. But these guys, it's just the only time you see the city is when the guy who's not a brother, but there's 3 people, right? So the guy who's not a brother, he goes and picks up the birds from whatever collection centers there are. You see him on a bus. That's all you see of the city. Otherwise, it's they're in this apartment and this workshop, which is a kind of a machine shop, I think, right? Where the father, who never says a word, does whatever they do with the metal working. So 35 million people, and you see 5 or 6 people. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I think this is a Muslim family, which is also very vulnerable to the political, situation that's unfolding in India at this moment. So
an important point.
There are, these pockets of extreme, segregated neighborhoods. And so I think, like, I don't know, like, whether this family is not so much out. I mean, they definitely have their own spaces, but it's actually, unfortunately, becoming very segregated in that sense. This would be a Muslim neighborhood. And that is why probably you'll see like the political seeping in. So, almost in a very obvious manner, because this is a neighborhood which is also under threat at that moment. So, but this is interesting, and this is probably, if I just want to hear everyone's thoughts on this, because this is something that I was thinking about when I was watching, because I loved this movie. That's why I've been thinking about it. But I also wonder, you'll see this intimate portrayal of the family and taking care of the birds, and then you'll also see this almost, Shaunak Sen does talk about this, the compression and decompression style of filmmaking, right? Like you'll see this very constricted sort of frame on one hand, and then the expansive skies with the birds sort of swirling, right? Like, so this is done in a way almost contrapuntally, if you could think of it. And then there's the camera also, like, slow pan, tilt. And in terms of when it is thinking about filmmaking in the domestic space, it's always like through the sliding sort of filming technique. So now, while I'm very much on board with this kind of filmmaking, I was somewhat sometimes I wouldn't say disturbed, but I was thinking about those shots at very low angle shots of like the squalor, like the rats scurrying in the garbage, and then those kind of shots, because it's almost like there was a juxtaposition, and it didn't have much to do with what the context was immediately prior to it, right? So I don't know what did you guys, if you guys
Well, and I'll say this, and then I'll pass the mic to either Dennis or Charles. I know that Charles in our conversations on Discord mentioned Herzog in relation to this particular type of filmmaking. I also thought, and Dennis will immediately know what I'm talking about, of Michael Mann, who even in his fictions, not documentaries, but Michael Mann he is primarily, I think, really solely a Los Angeles filmmaker, and Los Angeles is his topic, really, not whatever else happens to be happening. Like, it's a crime movie, but the actual star of the movie is Los Angeles and its environs, and that includes the wildlife that live in the city as well. And so there'll be, whatever the movie might be. Collateral comes to mind because Dennis and I have talked about this particular scene forever, in which there's a moment in which this assassin is going to do something, and I think it's Tom Cruise actually, and Mann pauses from whatever the action is to just show you, and this is probably something that happened inadvertently as he was filming, a coyote, just crossing a street, furtively, navigating the streets of the city. And one of the things about Los Angeles, as opposed to eastern seaboard cities, is that it's not as well lit. So sometimes, you'll be in places that are quite dark, which if you come from the east and then go to LA, it's rather jarring to be driving and you're like, well, where are the streetlights? And they're not always there. And so the coyote seems to emerge from nowhere. So you might say, well, the topic of this movie is, this assassin and what have you. Why would you do that? And I always interpreted that to mean that Mann was saying, yeah, this is a drama between these men, but ultimately maybe just kind of doesn't matter. I mean, it matters to them, but maybe just doesn't actually matter. Or if it does matter, it matters as part of the overall fabric of things. It is not the only story. It's not the prime story. It is a story in a fabric of stories. And I had the same feeling watching All That Breathes. Is that here's a part of the fabric of life. But I'll be quiet and let others speak up.
Well, if I could go first, you mentioned Mann, another filmmaker. So I thought of the first scene was very Lynchian, if that's a word. Ballardian, that's a word. So Lynchian can be a word. So you have you're down close to the ground with the rats, and like in the beginning of Blue Velvet with David Lynch, and then David Lynch goes, goes underground, and the director actually said, I think we're more like earthworms. He was talking about ours on the spectrum of creatures, that he wanted to be like an earthworm kind of point of view. I thought that was great. I mentioned earlier that he was so good in interviews, even when the interviewer is not that good. One of the interviewers said about the brothers, they're obviously intelligent. So what drives them to carry on with this? They could be doing other things, And he said,
that's quite rude. That's quite rude.
Exactly, and racist, and whatever else you want to put. So he says, well, their intelligence is a kind of binary opposite to what they do. And the interviewer said, oh no, I didn't mean it that way. And it's like, oh, really? How did you mean it? this guy is really good. And you know what? One thing I wanted to ask you. When he talks about the birds, he says that the first sort of the beginning of this movie is basically him and a friend who becomes a producer of the film. They're in a traffic jam, and they're looking up, and they see these kites, and they see one of them falling, and that's basically where this whole thing started, is them seeing. And what I wanted to ask you, I live in California, and I know a lot of people who grew up in Mexico, or their parents grew up in Mexico. And when they talk about Mexico, they say over there, you know? Normally in American English, you would say down there, right? So they say over there. So when he is talking about the birds, he says, he says, after he had that experience with seeing the bird fall, he said, I literally Googled exactly this. Where do birds that fall off the sky go? And that's how he came to the brothers. So I wanted to ask you, fall off the sky. Isn't that interesting? You know, I mean, in America, you would say fall from the sky. He's talking about fall off the sky. And he says that over. So anyway, go from there.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is an adjacent answer. I think one of the strengths of this movie, in terms of he is a very articulate speaker, so I'll definitely have to give it to him, because he definitely knows the theoretical lens that he's going for in terms of human non-human entanglement. He has a very strong theoretical philosophy which is backing his project. But there are also, like, I think my concern is also about the political balance of images, right? Like, because images matter. And I'll definitely talk a little bit about the strength of this movie. And I think I was trying to talk about this at the start, that in terms of the documentary filmmaking space in India, they have been doing exceptional work for many years now. So all that breeds is one amongst a crowd of important documentary films. But this is a movie which has been doing extraordinarily well, and which is very important as well, because it has I think it is bringing back much needed attention to the documentary space, and then also thinking of sort of emboldening that space. So in that sense, this movie is very important. And this movie is also very, very technically strong. One of the things that it does very well, and I was fascinated by how he did it, was this idea of, this laminated concept of the air itself, and to present the air in this very, very tactile, breathing way, which is, the metallic grayness of Delhi's industrial air, which is filled with a sense of melancholy, decay. It's almost like, as we speak, I think people are really like struggling to breathe in Delhi, and it's really bad. The air quality in Delhi is very, very bad. So he somehow manages to capture that aesthetic in a way that is extremely moving, tactile, and breathing, if I may use that term. So I think it is achieved through very, very technical color grading scheme. So he does use Ben Bernard, and who does the cinematography for Victor Kosovsky. If you're familiar with his work, he does your kind of cinematography, and he is also very, very important, a very, very interesting filmmaker. I've only watched one of his previous works. So he is definitely coming from a very, very theoretical lens of how he wants to show this. So yeah, I also read that interview where he said that how he first thought about where do birds go, and it might look startling when you read it, but it's actually, unfortunately, the truth in Delhi, that you will see birds sort of like literally, falling in front of you. So that is happening, like it's very much a part of the fabric of the city itself, just because it is extremely toxic and the air quality is extremely bad, and it definitely does appear in that sense. And he captured that in a very moving way, just the color grading, the scheme, in that sense, he does manage to capture that aspect.
Yeah, he says that the brothers are refreshing because they are unsentimental and they just get on with it. He calls it an elegant stoicness. And he says that he was weary of bleeding, this is a quote, bleeding heart sentimentality or doom and gloom of environmental discourse, especially in cinema and popular culture. And, I was reading, there's an interview I posted. They did about 400 hours of filming with handheld cameras. He was talking about when one of the brothers or somebody yawned, and he's like, okay, now we're going, because they are not paying attention to us. This is so it was I mentioned what is a documentary, because I've seen things on TV that are presented as documentaries, and they are just the most ridiculous sorts of cut and paste kinds of, like, okay, from the headline, all this kind of crap,
and there are also exercises in nostalgia, like the Gotti thing that you mentioned on Netflix. But before we get too further along, I wanted to give Charles a chance to have.
Yeah, Charles, how you doing?
No, I'm doing all right. Where to begin? So I'm going to kind of go off of what Dennis was saying. Continue. But for me, documentaries are, I would say, probably one of the hardest things to do in film and one of the easiest things to screw up. Because, as Dennis was noting, there are a lot of documentaries. They're everywhere. And sometimes they're good. Most of the time they're not. It really depends on whoever's. And so when I started watching this, I was not entirely sure if I was going to like it or not. One of the things you were pointing out was the way that the camera was used. And how, for example, that first shot in the film, I actually appreciated that shot. I thought it was very interesting, and the way it just slowly moved. What ended up happening later is I felt like those kind of shots were mostly to subvert the other scenes where it was focusing on the family and the brothers working together. And it wasn't to subvert it in the sense of anything like take away from it, but it was to kind of show that there's a larger world, a larger set of events going on while the family was trying to take care of kites, which I appreciated that he did that, or that they did. And what I appreciated the most, and I say this as a compliment, even though I'm a great fan of Herzog, I think it was a very non-Herzog style documentary. And the reason I say that is Werner Herzog has a concept called a static truth. I think we all have probably heard of it. I got to watch him talk about it in Minnesota when he was making fun of cinema verite. But Basically, he thinks Herzog thought that a documentary you can basically arrange things, set things up, and it's still the truth, more or less. There's more to it. And what I appreciated about this was that there was no attempt at symbolism. If there could be symbolism in the documentary, I think it's more up to the reader or the viewer as to whether they see any symbols or anything. But I don't think it was done on purpose. I think it was mostly, as you guys were saying, it kind of a stoic, unsentimental approach to using the camera in documentaries to capture what's going on and to give. I almost felt an almost oscillating picture between the larger world, whether it's the political protests, whether it's the pollution, whether it's the trash and the rats in the streets and things like that, and then showing the other side of that, which is the brothers working to take care of the kites, the way it affects the family, things like that. It was a good oscillation, which I appreciated. Just as well, trying to think. Let me look at my notes here real quick. First off, a funny thing is when he told him to stop worrying about his glasses when those got stolen. As somebody who wears glasses myself, if an animal stole my glasses, I'd be a little concerned. But sorry, go ahead.
That was obviously.
Yeah, right.
He comments on that in interviews. A complete accident, obviously.
Now, I will say, unlike Dennis, I haven't looked at
when you do 400 hours,
Right. Well, I was going to say, unlike Dennis, I haven't looked at a lot of the. So I mostly just watched the movie, the documentary itself. And I did look at the one interview that Amrita shared with us where he mentions his love-hate relationship with Herzog, which I appreciate. But one of the things that I appreciated also was whenever there was let's call it a voiceover, although that's perhaps not correct because it's more the changing of the scene while somebody who's being interviewed in the documentary is talking, but let's call it a voiceover. There were a few times where the voiceover seemed to make clear certain messages without throwing it in your face. One of the things I enjoyed about this is that unlike a lot of American documentaries, there is no attempt to be scandalous or to be dramatic, where something is set up on purpose as a sort of climax. In other words, instead of just like what they were doing, where you just let the camera catch what's going on, and you allow the viewer the ability to interpret it without being told how to. A lot of American documentaries, to me, seem to take real events that go on and try to move them in such a way that it fits a kind of, let's call it a kind of a cinematic plot, where you have the stuff where everybody gives the expositions at the beginning, you learn about everybody, builds up to a certain climax, and then. And I appreciated that. Sorry, go ahead.
I love the end.
Yeah.
When one brother is in America and they are speaking online, and there's a freeze,
Right.
That's life.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I appreciated that a lot. I just appreciated the to put it specifically, I appreciated that there was room for the viewer. A lot of documentaries are about, they won't admit it, but it's about convincing you.
Yes.
The first one that comes to my mind is someone like Michael Moore, where it's really, you leave you leave the movie theater feeling like you were flogged along with the documentary, because he just really wants to prove his point. In this case, there was a philosophy presented, which I appreciated, and I actually appreciated it because it helped. It presented a philosophy that blurs the line that we make between ourselves and between animals, where somehow humans are not animals. I think, to quote it specifically, excuse me, there's a line in there where they say, or one of them says, that humans forget that we're pieces of meat too. Yeah. And it's, I appreciated that line. There's a lot of lines I appreciated, which I got to pull my notes up here. My favorite line in the whole thing was kind of early, but it says that every life form adjusts itself to the city. And I feel like that was one of the themes and one of the reasons I appreciated the oscillation between family and then the larger life of the city, is because the statement being made was that animals are having to adjust to us, having to adjust to the way we live our lives. And when you think about the documentary, things start to make sense. For example, at least for me, when you have the moments where the camera is, watching the ants crawling, for example, or early on when there was the rats, or there was one shot that I particularly liked. There was a banner that was in water, and it had centipedes crawling on it, and there's something else. By the way, it gave me a real sense of, horror.
You're talking about Twitter. You're talking about the Twitter thing, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Twitter.com.
Right, yeah. And right, and I appreciate, kind of that the way it shows that, because basically, even as it changes from focusing on the brothers and the family to focusing on the city and nature in general, basically it's showing that it's showing the aspects of nature that are having to adjust to the city, which is why I think that quote from the documentary is so important. You see, I'm going to call them monkeys. I want to say baboon, probably. But you see the monkeys that are climbing across the rooftops. You see, for example, the guy who's being attacked by kites because they made a nest near where he was doing his work. And it's a very clear philosophical position that, nature is adjusting to our cities, adjusting to humanity, while also offsetting that by pointing out that humans are animals just like that, like the animals that are adjusting to us. And it doesn't, I don't know if it suggests this in the documentary necessarily, but you could go further and say that humans may at some point have to adjust, not only to our cities, but maybe to the way nature is adjusting to our cities.
Well, and that's, isn't that really the message of individuals who tell us about the impact of climate change, which is that, we've reached the end. We've almost reached the end of what we can do by pumping, CO2 in an uncontrolled experiment into the atmosphere. We've reached the end of being able to do that without facing significant consequences to the way of life, and to the 10,000 year era of growing and so forth, the seasons that our entire civilization was built on. So we have no choice but to adjust.
Well, that's one thing I also like about this in the context of climate change. In climate change, especially in the United States, there tends to be an argument between people who think that climate change is the end of the world, and people who think climate change doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And what's annoying, actually, is that they're both wrong. First off, climate change is very obvious. On the other hand, it's not really the end of the world. It's not apocalyptic. It doesn't have that sort of Christian edge to it. What it is that we're going to be forced to change the way we lived before, and basically, I'd argue the way we models looked at the world up until this point. The conditions that furnish that view will change. And, one of the issues I have with people on the environmental side is that they talk about legislation, and they talk about, controlling CO2 and stuff like that, the new Green Deal, and they talk about it as if that were implemented, things would go back to normal. And the thing is, you can't go back. Darwin said nature doesn't, or evolution doesn't jump, but evolution also doesn't go back. And so that's what I enjoy about this story, is that it's showing that the animals are adjusting to the city. It's showing that nature is adjusting to us, and then it's also implying, in my opinion, that we will have to adjust eventually, like the air quality.
Yes. Yeah, obviously, you have no choice. Yeah.
Could I jump in
here?
Go
ahead. Yep, go ahead.
I have a book, Mike Davis, Planet of Slums. Mike Davis, the anniversary of his death is about a year ago. This book is called Planet of Slums, and it's published in 2006. And I'm just going to read the beginning. Sometime in the next year or two, a woman will give birth in the Lagos slum of Ajengule. A young man will flee his village in West Java for the bright lights of Jakarta, or a farmer will move his impoverished family into one of Lima's innumerable pueblos jóvenes. The exact event is unimportant, and it will pass entirely unnoticed. Nonetheless, it will constitute a watershed in human history, comparable to the Neolithic or Industrial Revolutions. For the first time, the urban population of the Earth will outnumber the rural. Indeed, given the imprecisions of third world censuses, this epochal transition has probably already occurred. So we're talking about cities. Yeah. We live in cities. That's it.
Yes. And even people who don't think they do, even people who don't believe they do. To use a very silly example, if you watch the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills and observe the drone shots of the supposedly luxurious homes of these supposedly fabulous people, what do you notice in beautiful Southern California? They're all quite close together. It's a megalopolis, right? There's just houses covering these hills. Some of them selling for 10 million, some of them selling for 2 million, but they're all kind of gathered close together. And so there's just an uninterrupted or carpet of human built environment, right? And so even though it doesn't have the towering spires of Manhattan, which is obviously super dense, or Delhi, just obviously super dense, it's still super dense. It's just done in a way that sort of hides. Well, the hiding isn't so easy anymore, really. Right up to the coast of Malibu, if you've been and you drive, you're like, yeah, there's a lot of houses, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of built environment here, and so it's all city, even if it pretends that it's not. Even if the real estate agent tells the person who can afford a $3 million home, oh, you're so far from the city because you're surrounded by nature. No, you're still in a city. There's very little escape from the urban environment. However, what I will say at this point is that we have been officially recording for an hour, and you know our rule here. We try to stick as closely as possible to 60 minutes or thereabouts.
You're kidding. It's been an hour already?
It has indeed. The things have flowed. And so our philosophy here, Amrita, is not to abuse the good graces of our guest by, as some podcasters do, joining on 2 and 3 hours of just, how marvelous they are and yucking it up. That's not our way. So I am going to actually close our proceedings here. Any final words from everyone before I do so?
I have a question. We're speaking of connections, etc., etc. As far as I know, Charles and Amrita got together somehow, and that's how we ended up speaking here. So I was just kind of curious, where did you guys? Was it on Twitter or Facebook or what?
Twitter, which has become exciting. Yeah, I mean, I chanced upon, I think his posts, and I like the way that he talks about cinema from a philosophical point of view. And I, then looked up, I think, like this podcast and all. And I think this is a movie which kind of renders very well to a philosophical interpretation, given that it's like really made with a certain philosophy in mind. So that's how I think I, spoke about this movie first, I guess. Yeah. And if I don't know, like this, my main closing thing would be that what fascinated me the most when I first watched it was that, like having had access to that lived experience, and you're always mindful of human, non-human relationships, because that's just the space you occupy. But what I found fascinating about the treatment, the aesthetic treatment, was that there is no sort of, concession made to who this is being narrated for. Rather, it invites you into a certain kind of, patient watching, witnessing as well. So this is a movie that needs to be witnessed almost at its own pace. Like you adjust to the pace of the movie, right? It's a very Kiarostami kind of a technique, because he talks about that kind of patient filmmaking as well. And also, like, he does not try to narrate it for any kind of gaze, whether it's the Eastern gaze or the Western gaze, because he almost relies on this very, very foundational philosophy, which I think, Charles was talking about, that he connected with the most. This idea that, this human non-human bond, this interconnectedness, is probably the most common foundational thing that binds all of us, despite, wherever we might be located. And he relies on that kind of, philosophical sort of, foundation to sort of situate this movie. So I found that very, very beautiful and fascinating in terms of the treatment all over.
Yeah, Charles and Dwayne and I, we communicate on, what is it called? Discord? You guys remember I said I had my first AI conversation last night?
Yes.
With a veterinarian?
Yeah, well, let's just call it a chatbot, because the as you know, the term AI deeply offends me.
Yeah, right. Okay. So we wound up talking to a real person. But what I wanted to say is that I have been through, in the last 24 hours, a caretaking situation with an animal, with a dog. And it looks like the dog is not long for this world. And I have had a contentious relationship with this dog, because the dog was born not planned, put it that way, and raised by people in their 70s, so not a lot of training or discipline. And so this dog was just a madman. And every time I would come around, he would go, every time. But in the last 24 hours, I have helped my girlfriend take care of him, and he's as quiet as can be, because it turns out he has a tennis ball sized tumor.
Mm.
And like I say, he's probably not long for this world. So the caretaking, the all that breathes, you know, and, you know, and just, you know, speaking of Twitter and Gaza, the way people speak of human beings, let's not talk about animals, let's human beings as vermin, as it's just so, you know.
Yeah, the callousness is it's both unsurprising because it's happened repeatedly throughout our history, but
nits make lice. Have you heard that term? Nits make lice.
Yes, but it as common as it is, it never ceases to shock if you retain any sense of humanity, because you know we even as people do these things, we know that it's evil, right, to treat other human beings, you know, any living thing in this manner, and but we are indeed planning a show in which we will talk about, from a cinematic perspective, the history of the situation in on the Gaza Strip. But to close this show, Charles, I will give you an opportunity to say any closing thoughts you have.
Well, to I guess answer Dennis about meeting Amrita on Twitter. Yeah, she is one of the brighter spots on a very, very dark app. So I appreciated her responses to some of the things I posted and some of my reviews. So I would say probably meeting is the best way to describe. And I'm glad she came on here, and I'm glad she presented this documentary.
Yes,
I really appreciate it.
Yes, as do I, actually, because we want to, and actually, Amrita, any other films that you think are worth our consideration, because there are many films. The world of film is quite large, as you know, and one of the things that we don't want to do is balkanize ourselves into films that we're only aware of because of our biases, which are inevitable. Everyone has their perspective, right? I mean, I would turn this into a film noir podcast exclusively, but that wouldn't be. And maybe I'll do that on my own. I don't know, but unless my colleagues would like to join me. But this particular podcast is about film more broadly, and so what we want to do is explore as broadly as we can, in the time that we have. And with that, having said that, I thank you, Amrita, for joining us, and I also thank our listeners for joining us.
Very, very, very nice to meet you.
Yeah, absolutely. And for Film Conversations, this is Dwayne Monroe with my co-host, I should say, Dennis Claxton and R.C. Charles Rogers. Wait a minute, Rogers?
Oh, he's uncovered my secret name. I'm sorry. I gotta leave. I'm sorry.
Who's that? Charles Roberts, and I bid everyone adieu. Until next time.
Bye-bye.